Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar organized by JetBrains. I'm Paul Everett, PyCharm developer advocate, and I'll be your host. The topic for today's webinar is simple, fast front end with htmx. I'm really happy to be joined today by Carson Gross, the creator of htmx and intercooler.js. Before that, Carson runs Big Sky Software. I think the Big Sky gives it away. I think it's Montana. Is that right?
That's right. Yep.
See, I can do geography. Teaches computer science at a university, which someone on Twitter said that was really cool, and is the CTO of LeadDyno. Welcome, Carson.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. I've been very pleased to see how much htmx has been accepted by the Python community. So it's been great, especially the Django and Flask communities have really been hitting it hard, and it's been nice to be able to give them a tool that lets them stay in their preferred framework and in their preferred programming language.
Yeah, and for everyone that's out there that's watching and listening, a couple of points. First, Carson is everywhere all the time recently, including Talk Python. Michael Kennedy did an interview with you a couple of weeks ago. I thought it was really good. The other part of this, and in fact, you were just in a .NET one as well. The other part of this is, oh my God, this is like the thing that I care about the most in my life. And so I might get a little loud. Those of you over there in the comments that I'm looking at right now, Anchor, thank you. That's a great comment. If I get too loud, let me know, because over enthusiasm and microphone distance is a bit of an issue. Carson, your mantra is, your technical approach is to look for hot new trends in the industry and then do the opposite of that. I love it. Tell us a little bit about your background, the what and the why of htmx, and hell, I don't care. Tell us what you think. What is the web?
Sure. Well, that is true. I'm a contrarian by nature. I've just always been that way. And that's fine. It's, sometimes it can be it can be difficult, and I can be obstinate at times. So as I've gotten older, I try to temper that a little bit. But I do think the industry is, the computer industry is subject to trends, and some bad ideas have come and gone. One that sticks out in my mind, just because it happened early in my career, was Enterprise Java Beans, the 1.0 version. And I remember being really upset with the way that went down. And so I have sort of always looked with a jaundiced eye at the latest and greatest stuff to come out of the thought leaders in the industry. And I think htmx and intercooler before that reflect that. They were sort of reactions against the complexity of much of the front end, many of the front end frameworks that were coming out in the JavaScript world. I maybe try and approach things from a little bit simpler perspective, try and go with the grain of the web. We'll talk about what the web is. As far as htmx is a way to add interactive behavior to a web application just with attributes in your HTML directly. And so it tries to take HTML and improve HTML rather than saying, okay, HTML is a thing that you're going to have to produce eventually, but you're going to focus on JavaScript. You're going to be producing JavaScript code to make your UI work. And so it's really trying to take HTML as hypermedia or hypermedium and extend it, give you more power within HTML, kind of staying within HTML. And that kind of folds into what my idea of the web is, which I didn't really understand. I've been programming in the web for a long time. I started in the late 90s, right when the web was getting going, doing CGI scripts and stuff like that. Applets, if you remember what an applet is. But I didn't really, I feel like, have a very good understanding of what hypermedia was, what HTML was at a fundamental level, and what the RESTful architecture was for the web until I built intercooler.js. And as I was building intercooler.js, I had people pointing out to me, hey, this is neat because it's an extension of the hypermedia model of the web. And eventually I read stuff and understood stuff well enough to really get that. And so htmx and intercooler before that are really trying to take this hypermedia idea. You have a document, it has hyperlinks and other things going on in it, and then it's exchanging in a stateless manner, in a RESTful manner with the back end, sort of simple, large grain requests is the way Roy Fielding would say it, and updating HTML. It's just HTML going back and forth. And so to me, that's what the web is. The thing that made the web so amazing and so reliable and so flexible was this idea of hypermedia. And so HTMX, again, is trying to take that and give you more, let you accomplish more within that original idea, within that original conceptual model.
I was just thinking that if the UI of the web really is going to be put your HTML and CSS inside JavaScript that's minified and tree shaken, and you want to go view source that, we've come a long way. So thank you for putting HTML back into the web. I'm going to, by the way, I'm looking at Carson here and I'm looking at comments over here. And Misha points out that there's a really good interview with Django Chat that you did a couple of weeks ago as well. I really enjoyed that one also.
Yeah, the Django Chat, that was a great talk. And Python Bytes was awesome too. It's been great. A little exhausting. I'm an introvert by nature. So,
I'm sorry. And Carson and I were joking that in the future we'll do this dressed as Daft Punk so that you can be an introvert and we can add a little bit of fun to this. My lead in was a little bit off. I say I'm the PyCharm developer advocate. I'm PyCharm and WebStorm, which really means I'm Python and web, but you're not Python and you're not PyCharm. You're actually a WebStorm customer. Happy user?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I have a subscription to everything. I have that all. So, and I use RubyMine, IntelliJ. What's the C and C++ one? CLion. I use CLion for some of my classes. So I'm an IntelliJ person. So HTMX, intercooler, and hyperscript, which we might talk about, are all developed in WebStorm. It's just I picked up IntelliJ tools, I picked up IntelliJ, so JetBrains tools, very early on in my career. Actually, first saw it at Google. I interned at Google for a little bit, and that was one of they supported two editors, Emacs and IntelliJ, and so I picked up IntelliJ.
All right, thanks for the kind words.
Yeah, absolutely.
People may ask, Carson doesn't do Python, and so you may say, how can you bring a non-Python person to a PyCharm webinar? I'll explain, but first, Carson, you like to say HOWL. Can you explain that?
Yeah, HOWL. So HOWL. That's a stack that I've made up, and I'm trying to get people to use. So there's Jamstack and what's LAMP, right? What was that? And there's a bunch of different stacks that you can use. And so HOWL stands for hypertext on whatever you'd like. And the idea there is that if you use hypertext as your exchange with your backend, then you can use whatever backend you'd like. And that's in contrast with the situation where you're using JSON. If you're using JSON on the front end or as your exchange with your backend, and presumably writing a lot of JavaScript on the front end, there's a lot of pressure for you to adopt JavaScript on the back end. And so, with HTMX, my hope is that people can use whatever backend technology they'd like. For example, Python. Now, Python's been growing very dramatically in the last few years, whereas JavaScript's actually flatlined a little bit in the last 5 years. And so it's a shame if people feel pressure to adopt JavaScript on the back end just because that's what they happen to be using on the front end. And so HTMX, there's some other technologies that I think fall under this idea as well. But HTMX, by putting the focus back on HTML and by emphasizing this exchange of hypermedia with the server, allows you to use whatever you want on the back end. Python, Go, Julia, there's a lot of languages that people are very passionate about. And so fine, that's fine. And if you adopt HTML as your exchange with your server, then you're welcome to use it. It's just templating on the back end. And so, so that's the idea with that is, you should be able to use whatever you want. Not everyone likes JavaScript. I don't like JavaScript. That's all right. I've written a lot of JavaScript now, but
yeah, you had
I
a
wouldn't
joke
use
about
it.
that. For someone
Yeah,
who
but
doesn't want to write JavaScript.
Yeah, exactly. As someone who doesn't like JavaScript, I've written an awful lot of JavaScript to avoid writing JavaScript. So it just, my hope is that it opens the back end up. And so HTMX is back end agnostic in that sense. We don't put any requirements on you on the back end. And so if you want to use .NET, Python, Flask versus Django, whatever it is, it's fine. HTMX will work with it. And just take your HTML.
Just to put an exclamation on that, Carson is exactly right. The major JavaScript frameworks are busy on the next step that will really encourage you to render on the server. That is the big thing coming. And so for us in the world of Python, we need to be able to have a story that scratches the itch of why people want some of this interactivity in the front end. Okay, let's talk a little bit about how we're going to do this webinar. It's going to be different. Why? Because I care a lot on this one. I'm doing the driving, and I'm going to show demos from the HTMX website, and Carson's going to sit in the peanut gallery. He's going to explain, and he's also going to tell me where I got things wrong. So with that in mind, let's go through a little bit about the format of the webinar. We'd like to make this webinar as conversational and live as possible, as you can see already. So should you have any questions or problems during the webinar, please feel free to ask them at any time during the presentation right over there in the YouTube chat. That question about why don't you like JavaScript, Carson, shall be explained in the next 45 minutes. We'll have a few pauses during the webinar, probably after each demo, where Carson and I will answer your questions. We, the PyCharm team, and others will be over there answering questions right now in the YouTube chat. Don't wait for the end. Ask your questions as soon as you have them. Usually, the most important question is this thing being recorded? Yes, it's currently being recorded, and the recording will be available in this YouTube channel basically immediately. Every webinar I do, I've done 5 trillion webinars in the past 5 years. I make the same joke every time. In 5 minutes, somebody's going to ask if this thing is being recorded. Look over there, wait for it, see when it's going to happen. So with all of that set, we're ready for the first demo. If we could go ahead and switch over. Nope, we're already switched over. I'm going to get over into the browser and get to the demos. First, we're going to be following along the examples on the HTMX website. I've taken them, I've converted them to some that are static pages on disk, some that are fast API, and a quick demo of Django at the end. Don't ask me to publish this. I did. I got in a little over my head. I got to clean up my software before I share it. But for your viewing pleasure, we're going to be going through some of these demos and taking a look at them. So we'll go ahead and begin. And Carson will follow along. I'll give a demo. I'll talk about it a little bit. And then Carson will talk with me a little bit. I'll switch over to side by side. And we'll explain the what, the why, and the how of this demo. And then I'll come back and take a look at some of the questions. So click to load. This demo is, I started with this one because I felt like it's like the easiest one to understand. It works off of files off this, like a static site generator. Doesn't require a back-end app server like Django or Fast API. It's just a get. But it's like already awesome because it lets you go scratch the itch that might make you switch to the 15,000 NPM packages of Gatsby. You can HOWL, stay with your own stack, and walk up to this and click and get more data from the back end. Now, how is it doing it? Over in the source, we have a button that says hx-get. And why don't I go over to PyCharm and we'll take a look at this one. So this is the example in Jinja 2, basically rendered to a static HTML file. And what we have is this is the first run, and it's got one row of data in it. We don't want to load all the data because it would be too big of a payload. We want the user to be able to go get the next data. And so what we have is a button, and we add this attribute to it. By the way, I was able to add this in WebStorm / PyCharm with Alt-Enter and teach it to learn that attribute name and get rid of the warning. So what I'm saying is when you click this button, htmx is going to jump in and it's going to take over that click handler. And it's going to use this as a DSL to feed the JavaScript that Carson already wrote for you. And we're using this DSL to give 3 instructions. Go get this page. When the page comes back, shove it in replace me. And then use this strategy for how we do the update. It could be inner HTML, outer HTML, etc. And then maybe along the way, we might have a little loading indicator. All right. This all worked really well for me the first time. Carson, I will put you up side by side with me and talk a little bit about this example.
Yeah, actually, would you mind if we looked at the code? Just
yeah, sure.
Is that all right?
Yep.
I think that'd be good for me. So, yeah. So what this is, as you kind of went through it, the hx get is saying when someone does something, in this case, it's a button. So that's by default, that something is going to be click. It's going to retrieve that via an AJAX call. And that HTML is going to come back and it's going to take that HTML and swap it into the DOM somehow. And so you've got HX swap down below, which says outer HTML. And so what that's going to do is it's going to replace the entire table row with the ID replace me with whatever content comes back. And presumably that's going to be 2 rows of content in that in page 2, right? So the original row and then this new row. And that's the basic idea with htmx, is a few attributes that tell htmx, hey, go and get some HTML and then swap it into the DOM somehow. So that's the big idea here, and you can target whatever you want. A couple things I'd say here in this example is if for hx target you have hash replace me, and that's a CSS selector that we're all hopefully familiar with. In this case, what you could do instead of hash replace me is you could say closest space tr. And what that would do is it would replace the content of the closest matching selector, which in that case, as a parent, the closest TR is exactly that ID. And then you could drop that ID from that table row. And that might be a little cleaner, a little bit more, it's your call. That's a preferences thing.
This could, I joked during the tech check with Carson, this could be a 17-hour webinar, because I've got like 50 things that just popped in my head, with one of them being you support bubbling.
Yep. So
can you explain what I just said?
So when you mean bubbling, you mean event bubbling?
Yep.
Like as far as, yeah. So HTMX tries to take concepts that you're already familiar with on the web and use them. And so most of the attributes that you have in HTMX are inheritable. And so you could move, for example, HX target up you could even move it up to the TR if you wanted to. So, I mean, there's a bunch of different ways to skin this cat, but you could change that from closest TR, which is a little redundant, to just this. Yes. Yeah, to this. And then anything inside of that table row now, the default target for it is going to be this. You can override it by putting another HX target on something if you want to target some other element. But that's the idea, is that HTMX has this concept of inheritance, and that lets you avoid repeating yourself.
Sure.
Some people don't like it. You don't have to use it. And it does violate something that I call locality of behavior, in that you're moving the behavior away. You're moving the behavior away from this button, and now you kind of have to look in 2 places to understand exactly what this button does. And that's just something that's, you have to make a judgment call as an engineer as to whether or not that's a better way to go. The other thing that I want to say about this example is it swaps the outer HTML. And in a paging example like this, it would be more common in my experience to instead I think it's append after. There's an HX swap. Hold on, I'll have to look it up.
Don't worry about it. We got a lot of questions to answer.
Yeah. Okay. So, but normally the way with something like this is you'd actually append the content after the row rather than replacing the whole thing with the entire new table. And that's just because that's the way a paging library would typically work. But this is perfectly acceptable. It just depends.
To zoom back out and summarize before going over to questions, Carson is talking about some big things. The biggest one to me is HTML is just okay.
Yep.
He also likes to talk about hypermedia as the engine of application state. We'll have a demo on that where you get to wax prolific about it.
Perfect.
And then finally, this locality of behavior.
Yeah.
And so there are some articles out there being written about. You wrote that one back in the intercooler days, if I remember correctly.
No, locality behavior, I wrote about it, but locality of behavior, there's an essay on htmx on the talk page. If you go to htmx.org/talk, there's a locality of behavior essay. And it's a term I'm trying to popularize as in contrast with separation of concerns in particular. Most web developers are familiar with separation of concerns where you pull things into different files, and there are advantages to that, but there's also disadvantages, which you can the primary one being it's hard to understand what a button does and why it looks like it does just by looking at that button. You have to go into a bunch of different files. And with HTMX, you tend to put the stuff on the button. And so it's much easier to understand, oh, that's what this button is doing. In contrast with jQuery handlers over in some JavaScript file or whatever.
Tailwind and Alpine.js are kind of getting popular for similar things, which I'm going to do a speed round through questions. I apologize for going so fast. If any of you want to follow up with me for longer, semi-accurate answers, come find me on Twitter. Anchor makes a good point. You will still need things like Alpine.js for the islands. That's another idea that's starting to spread, is that use JavaScript for your islands, not for your entire page. Question about what language for backend, Python or JavaScript. I'll let the title of the webinar just speak for itself on that. What do we think
whatever
about
you like?
Yes. HOWL. Yes.
Yeah, whatever you like.
What do we think about WASM? I will answer that one. Forget about it for the next 3 years at least. Got a long way to go before you will ever be using it. A question from Anthony. How does this actually work? Very well. Okay, next question. No, sorry. How does this actually work? Is this listening to mutations in the whole page and looking at HX- attributes that then just apply some DOM changes? I believe the answer is no. Actually, Anthony corrects it, listening to events. Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, just when content is loaded, HTMX scans the DOM for these attributes and hooks in event listeners. So it's not super sophisticated. And we don't, just because it's so expensive and typically not needed if you adopt a good hypermedia model, we don't listen for mutations. You can do it if you'd like. And there's a small JavaScript API for working with HTMX to when you have out of what I would call an out of band mutation to your DOM and new attributes are added. And so you got to hook stuff up again. But it's not a focus of the library. So,
okay, I'm going to give you one last question. You're on a time limit because I know you could do 3 hours on it. So keep it under 30 seconds. I know the answer because I heard you talking, I think, to Michael Kennedy about it. Should the meta language HTMX get adopted by the DOM standards committee in the W3C?
I do think HTMX is how HTML should work, in my opinion. I think they should look hard at it and, obviously not adopt the syntax, but if they want to drive HTML forward as a hypermedium, then yes, in my opinion, this is the way to do it.
There are standards like HTML include and some things related to that. And you think, oh, wow, that's it. That's what I wanted. But it's really about importing JavaScript at the end of the day. I mean, all roads go through JavaScript. Okay, let's go on to the next.
Poor HTML. Can't get no
Poor
respect.
HTML. No kidding. Hey, I went through my I put all my chips on XHTML2, Xforms, and Xlink.
Yep. I know.
Didn't work out for me.
I sympathize.
Okay, toggle message. This is a pretty similar one. In a way, this is even simpler. The default message gets changed to something loaded from the server. And this is really simple, but what I want to do on this one is reload this and show the network in action. All right. And I'm going to leave it as all. I'm going to do an exercise for the audience. Which one of these should I click if I want to see the request generated when I click on default message? Anyone? Let's see how everyone does on this. I'm going to click it. So there you go. In the background, it did an XML HTTP request to go get something that was a response type of HTML, and then did its little trick to jam it into the DOM. Carson, any hidden complexity there?
No, not really. We've got a div here, which some people might complain about because there's accessibility issues with that. But all it's doing is when it ran into that div and it saw that HX get is it said, okay, well, it's a div. The default action on divs and most stuff is click. So let's add a click listener. And when someone clicks that, we're going to retrieve this content. And the default action is to replace the inner content of the current element. And so you can change all that with attributes like HX target, HX swap, and HX trigger, excuse me. So you can change all those things, but by default, that's what it's going to do. And so it makes a real simple example like that.
All right, over to one that gets into a little bit more snazziness. Lazy loading. What happened was when I loaded this arrived after. It's not actually in the original content. What happens is we have some new stuff from htmx called trigger. And this is saying basically what event am I looking for to happen, click or something like that. Well, I'm looking for the page load event. Carson in a second will tell us what actual event we're looking at for that. And then when that happens, go perform this action. And for that little bit of time, I mean, if I had a slow server, you would see this in there, a little indicator. And then because of the HTMX styling, I've got something available to grab and do a little bit of CSS styling on. Carson, how's that for an explanation? And do you want to explain some of the mechanics?
No, I think that's really good. This is a great demo. So lazy loading in particular, I think is extremely useful. It's a little surprising to people, but this is really good for perf issues. So very often you'll have a UI that has some part of that UI that is very expensive to calculate. And unfortunately, in the original web model, that meant you had to wait for the entire UI to complete before you could stream back all the HTML. Well, with this pattern, you can pull out that expensive part to a separate request and let the entire page render and then show a spinner as you compute this more complicated, more expensive part of your UI. And that can make the perceived performance of your web application much better. So this is a great pattern, very useful. I probably use this pattern as much as anything else, particularly when I'm doing perf work. And I think everything you've explained is great. The styling that you're doing, we won't get into the details of it, but there's a model for swapping in new content. And so what you're saying there is as this thing goes from what's called the settled state to the final state, make its opacity 1 and kind of fade it in. That gives that nice transition effect you're looking for. And so that's another good example of where HTMX is trying to work with the technologies we already have in the web, transitions, which typically you had to write JavaScript previously to use them, and now you don't, because HTMX provides these sort of checkpoints for you to write transitions between, which is really nice.
So a couple of things to ask you on that. Is that whole setting of the CSS class, this one, and then unsetting it during the life cycle of the directive, is that all just within this directive?
Yeah, that's part of the infrastructure. HTMX has a swapping model. So forget that I won't go into it's pretty complicated, but it lets you write transitions between without having to write JavaScript. So if you have a div, for example, that has a class 1 on it and it switches to class 2 when it's replaced in the content, then you can write a transition from class 1 to class 2 in CSS, and that transition will occur because of the way swapping is done internally in HTMX. It's a little elaborate. I won't go into too many details on it, but it's all there, and there's documentation on it. I would call that advanced HTMX.
Speaking of documentation, CSS transitions is what you're talking about right now. Later, we'll talk about animations. Lots of good content in these docs.
Good.
One thing I want to add, you made the comment about you break accessibility by having a div be clickable and stuff like that. I'm using the Bulma CSS library, and it's got 5 trillion ways to make things a link that shouldn't be linkable.
I'm sympathetic to the accessibility folks, but I also think sometimes they can hurt their own cause just by being a little bit doctrinaire about it. And so I like a cooperative idea, like, hey, let's try and move this way. But I don't know. I understand where they're coming from, and I've tried to start using buttons as my default element rather than divs.
Okay, how about you take some questions? Is it possible to do auth stuff with HTMX? I'm not going to show a demo of it, so I'll let you handle this one.
Yeah, auth works what I call the normal way. So cookie-based, session-based authentication. If you're using something like Django, for example, there's almost certainly a bunch of good authentication libraries if it's not available default out of the box. And so the traditional way on the web is, you'd have a login page, you'd log in, that would establish a session cookie, and then that session cookie was your identity. And so because HTMX is working in that HTML model, it just works what I call the normal way. And so that's, each backend is going to have its own authentication mechanism. That's the preferred way to do it. And so you can just use that for your login page and you're good to go because cookies are sent the normal way with HTMX. There's no header or anything like that. If you have the cross-site scripting tokens and so forth, then those need to be wired into the requests. The way that HTMX works is it includes the closest enclosing form of an element. So that will include that token if it's a hidden input, for example. And then there are ways to, there are various plugins that have been created to integrate HTMX with, for example, the big one that I'm aware of is HTMX Django. My understanding is that wires that token in automatically.
We will see a demo of CSRF support in Django.
Yeah. So, it's kind of I'd call it the normal way. There's nothing fancy going on here.
It's certainly our job over in the world of Python to create really useful recipes showing with the major frameworks how to do some of this stuff. Ruslan, I think we answered about accessibility. Craig asked, do you have a testing preference for HTMX? I know you talked about this in one of your podcasts.
Yeah, I don't have a preference, but I use, is it Mocha?
You use Mocha.
Chai? Yeah, and then Sinon.js's mock server. Those are, I don't like the way the Java community or JavaScript community, builds their software for the most part. And so just because lots of dependencies, lots of things flying around. But that's what I ended up using. And HTMX is browser only library, so you don't have to use there's no build step. You can just include it off a CDN and it just works. And so because of that, I have to do browser testing. And browser testing, unfortunately, isn't a big focus of the JavaScript community these days, as far as I can tell anyways. And so I had to do a lot of work to make that all work well. But in fairness, it does work. And we have a pretty extensive test suite for HTMX. So
I have a 12-part video series on React, TypeScript, and TDD in WebStorm and PyCharm. And Hello World takes about 5 seconds for a single test to run. Does not spark joy.
No.
Gabe asks a question about providing credentials such as JOT tokens for authenticated API endpoints. I think that's outside of the scope of HTMX.
Yeah, well, we're just really quick. HTMX does have an event model, and one of the primary events is config HTMX : config request, and so you can hook into that event using a JavaScript handler, and then put whatever header you want into the AJAX request. So we can work with all that stuff. It's just not a big focus. There's actually a declarative way to do it as well, but so we can work with that if necessary, but it's a little bit more work.
Sure. And if there isn't something out of the box, you have an extension model.
Yep.
And extensions are drop dead simple.
Yep. Yeah, really, that was a big focus of mine.
Yeah. Okay. And Craig, if your question was about testing full stack HTMX with Django or Fast API or something in Python, this is something I'm interested. I've been a TDD unit test, and when I want to test HTML, I use Beautiful Soup, but this requires JavaScript. And so if I want to do end-to-end testing, taking a look at the DOM isn't enough. And so Pylenium is something I'm interested in. It's Selenium Python that feels like Cypress, they advertise. Okay, on to the next example. And let's see, infinite scroll. I'll go through this one, but I want to speed up and get to these two so that we can then get over to the back end stuff. So infinite scroll this one was a little hard to demo because my div over here goes a long way. So I put it inside an overflow div. But as I'm scrolling along, I get near the end. And when I get to the end, I want more stuff to load. So I got to the last one. Now, how did that work? I put, and let me go into PyCharm. I put on the last one little sprinkles. And this is back to the whole DSL declarative. You don't have to write JavaScript. Carson's giving you a DSL. In fact, he's going to give you a DSL called hyperscript, which is even more of a DSL. But for this, an attribute-oriented DSL, where you just fill in the blanks and the correct effects happen. And the correct effect here is when the revealed event happens, I want you to do this stuff. Yep. And it's just not that complicated.
No, it really isn't.
You want to cover this a little bit?
Yeah, just, again, infinite scroll. I'm not a huge fan of the pattern in many situations, but there are places where it's appropriate. And so, yeah, you want to get page 2. That would presumably be encoded as you're generating this on the back end. You know what page you're on, so you put the next page on this last row. And then you want to trigger on revealed. And so that revealed event is a synthetic event that HTMX creates when something scrolls into view. There's also intersect, which uses intersection observer, which is a little bit more advanced. Unfortunately, so HTMX tries to be IE 11 compatible. It has been in the past, and so intersect doesn't work on IE. So you just have to be aware of that. You're giving up IE compatibility if you use that event. And then HX swap here is saying after end, and so what that's saying is add the content that comes down from the server after the end of this current tag of this table row. And so that new content is going to get jammed in there, and that new content presumably will have another final row that has something very similar but has the next page on it. And so you just scroll on down, and you can throw an indicator in there if it's going to take a while and so forth. But I think this is a great example of 3 attributes to achieve something that's considered a fairly sophisticated UI pattern on the web, and we don't have to break out of the HTML model to do that. These are all attributes that a normal someone who's familiar with HTML should be pretty comfortable with these things.
Okay, the one question we have is more like a comment. Why don't we like JavaScript? For me, I spend most of my time these days in JavaScript, and I don't necessarily mind JavaScript, but I'm a Python person. I'm a Python in the web person. And I dislike this idea that the UI of the web now has to be written in JavaScript, and everyone else's job is to pump JSON to it.
Yep.
That HTML is no longer a thing. It is an API that's called by JavaScript engines. So that's my answer about not liking JavaScript. I like it for progressive enhancement, but I do not like having to write my entire UI in JavaScript. I want any language, HOWL, to be able to work on the web. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. I'm a programming language person. I've created a couple programming languages in my life, and there's just design decisions about JavaScript. I mean, there's that meme joke that's like JavaScript and JavaScript the good parts. If you've ever seen that picture of the two books, it's not a great programming language. It's very familiar. I'm not, Ruby, which is what I spend most of my time in these days, I'm also not a huge fan of. There's a lot of language decisions that were made in there. So I think it's okay to work in a language you're not a huge fan of. I just prefer a more structured language. TypeScript looks like it might be all right. I haven't done any significant amount of work in it. But part of it is just subjective. Some people really like Lisp. That's okay.
Yeah. I also don't like that I need 2000 npm packages to write modern JavaScript stuff. So
definitely
it isn't that I don't like JavaScript. I don't like JavaScript everywhere.
Yeah, and that infrastructure, like the infrastructure is, as with Java and the J2EE world, I feel like JavaScript has sort of cultural issues that have come up and that make it tough to work with depending on your style of development. But it's subjective. I'm not going to try and talk you out of liking JavaScript.
Okay, on to HOWL, the worst acronym in all of computing, which is a shame because it represents such an important idea. I'll let you pitch the idea. I'll give the demo, and then we'll come back and show what's being done.
Sure. So you're right. It's a bad acronym, and it's not explained very well either. So let's see if I can do a better job of it. So hypertext is the engine of application state. You may have heard of. If you did hear about it, you probably heard about it in terms of a JSON API, and almost certainly in why we're not doing HOWL. But what HOWL is effectively is that when you're building a web application, like a real web application, that the hypertext should be the engine of application state. And so it's your hypertext or your hypermedia that should be representing what is going on the server. And then you exchange a request with the server, and that server streams down new hypertext or hypermedia that says, okay, here's the new state of the system. So just to pick a simple example, I make a put or a post to cause something to change on the server. And then the server says, okay, it makes that change on the back end and then streams back some HTML representing the new state of the world on the server. And all of that state is there in the hypermedia. It's not living in a side store in like a JSON model or whatever on the client side. Rather, it's encoded directly in the document itself, in the hypermedia itself. And so there's a lot of really big advantages to that model. The biggest one, I think the most obvious one, is that when that new HTML comes back, it contains all of the actions that are now available in the system, right? Yeah. So if I click some button to mutate, say, a contact, I archive them. Well, when the hypermedia comes back from that, that new hypermedia can contain everything I can now do with an archived contact inside of it. All the buttons and so all the actions that are available are within that. And the outer system, the model, the code that's been written, that's loaded already, the JavaScript code, it doesn't need to know anything about that. It's all right there in that little bit of hypermedia. And so that's how the state of the application is encoded in the hypermedia itself. And so it's a really powerful idea. It's very flexible when contrasted with, for example, thick client applications as they were built in the 1990s, even through to today. And in some ways, I feel like many of the JavaScript frameworks are encouraging us to go back to that older model where you know what the endpoints are, right? Like in a thick client, you have to know. This is like people are like, oh, give me your API docs. Well, in a really RESTful HOWL-based system, you don't need to know the API. You just need to know the entry point, and then everything surfaces itself through hypermedia. And so that's the big idea. That's what HOWL is, and that's how it's useful, and that's why it's so flexible. And so that's what we're trying to resurrect.
The real thing is, anyone who's ever used a web browser knows exactly what it is.
Yeah,
I have links that I can click on to go edit the to-do. I mean, it's there. In your article, let me see if I can get to that. It's under essays, right?
Yeah, under talk.
Okay. All right.
Down at the bottom.
Yep. Okay.
Which
so these get into this discussion a little bit. Let's get into the demo, and then let's talk about how it works, and then get back to a couple of really good questions. So the demo here is tabs.
Yep.
In other contexts, we would go reach for 2000 NPM packages and a bundler and a level. Your complexity budget would be shot before you got the demo out the door.
Yep.
Instead, this is the demo. And as I'm clicking, I'm going to the server and getting the tab content.
Yep.
Now, how am I doing that? I have let me make this. Okay. Yeah. So I'm saying, here's a div. It's got some tabs. And what I want you to do is it's triggered by after 100 milliseconds, go load tab 1, put it in here, use this swap strategy, and tab 1 looks like this. And it's got the handlers for clicking on each tab in it. So we got two basic handlers, one which is load the tabs, or load the first tab. And then from then on, the server is in charge by sending hypermedia that describes all the possible actions, 3 tabs.
Yep.
And then when I get to tab 2, it looks pretty simple. It says tab 2 is active, not tab 1.
Right.
And here are your other 2 things that you can do.
Yep.
So I'll stop with that because the hyperscript version of this is really compelling. Sure. But I'll stop with this, let you talk about it, and then let's get over to some questions.
Yeah. So, and normally if you're doing web development in say Flask or whatever, if you have a templating system, you normally pull this navigation out to a shared template between the 3, so you wouldn't have to repeat yourself. And that's one thing about htmx is it pushes the factoring problem of your software to the back end. And so you just have to do the normal thing where
something you already know.
Yeah. So it wouldn't be quite as repetitive as this. But you're right in that once again, all of the state of the system is being captured by HTML and HTTP requests. And so you don't have to maintain any additional fanciness. If you go to the original page for this,
by the way, the reason that this isn't factored the way you described is this is a static site generator version. There is no other thing sitting back there.
Right. Yeah. And that's, again, that's fine. That's a fine way to factor your stuff. If you're using a static site generator, that's fine. Here, what you might do instead of issuing another request for tab 1 is you might just inline that tab 1 HTML content directly in this thing just to avoid that additional request. Right. That would be fine.
I had that originally and then I removed it.
Yeah, and so you're factoring it out based on whatever your technology is.
Basically, you're saying take all of this,
put
it in here,
right,
and then get rid of this.
You can get rid of that guy, it depends on what your backend technology, what you have available. And HTMX is backend agnostic, so you do whatever works best for the particular technology that you're using, and that's fine.
Hey, let's take some questions. How does this compare? This is a really good question because it's bigger than what Maxime is really. I mean, he's asking a big question, but it's even bigger. Talking about Ruby, how do you compare HTMX with Turbo, Links, and Stimulus, Hotwire?
Yeah, it's definitely a competitor with them. HTMX, I feel like, comes at the problem from a different perspective than those technologies. So DHH and 37 Signals, the way that they approach software is they like big system, or not necessarily big, but they like total solutions.
That's right.
And so they provide infrastructure that makes everything just work. So they're, maybe, if you want to think of it in a metaphorical way, they're more like Apple. You know, you just plug it in and it works, and that's great until it doesn't, if you're familiar with Apple stuff. Whereas HTMX comes at it from this different direction, saying, let's take HTML and push it forward as a hypermedia. And so because of that, it's a little bit lower level. You have to understand HTML, I think, a little bit better in many ways. But on the other hand, it's a little bit more powerful. And so maybe it's, you know, a little closer to Linux in that sense. And that if you know what you're doing, once you build up the basics, you can do a lot more, and it's much more flexible. But it's not that total solution that kind of just works necessarily. So, and I would say HTMX is maybe a little more incremental. You can sprinkle it in a little bit more easily.
Like progressive enhancement.
Yeah, you can. It's just a smaller, it's just a smaller library overall. And then it's really the mindsets are just different. It's like, let's push HTML forward, I would say, is the HTMX mindset.
But the thing that I say why this is a bigger question than Maxime is asking is there's a trend going on where there's a backlash against JavaScript fatigue. There's which is a developer experience issue, but there's a backlash on web rendering about JavaScript being on the critical rendering path.
Yeah.
And there are several initiatives, including by the creators of Angular, to do, and Solid.js and all these other things that are like, don't give me a VDOM, don't make me have to rehydrate, don't make me do all these things before you get your time to interactive.
Yeah.
Let's do HTML again. And so this is part of a bigger trend.
Yeah, well, generating HTML on the server side is not significantly more expensive than generating JSON typically. And that's usually not it's not on your critical path anyways. Like once you hit a data store on your back end, the string concatenation is a round off error. Like it's true. It doesn't matter. You could emit the collected works of William Shakespeare and it'd be fine. So that doesn't matter. And then you have to say, HTML parsing on the front end is in C++ and it's really, really fast.
Oh gosh.
And so contrast that with even the fastest parsers written in JavaScript or any logic written in JavaScript whatsoever. And it's a no-brainer. So it can be a much faster technology for the infrastructure. And I think you're starting to see that as they try and back off back to, doing server-side rendering. But then you got to ask yourself, well, okay, why do we have JavaScript here? For interactivity? Well, here's another tool you can use to achieve similar interactivity.
And as this kind of touches on something Sander is pointing out, not only does it massively speed up kind of like rendering time and all that stuff, but it also speeds up development time, especially if you already have a stack that you're massively productive in.
Yep. That's right. There's a ton of very good ideas that in web development that were dropped when the server side became a dumb JSON producer and didn't do anything else except produce JSON. There a lot of things just kind of went away that great tools that we had developed on the back end. So templating libraries, caching, sessions, understanding SQL really well. That's something people, now they want GraphQL on the front end, and I'm going, no, you don't. You want SQL on the back end. SQL there's a lot of really good tools around it, and that's going to give you what you want. You can produce whatever HTML you want, and then just stream that to the front end, and you're good to go. I think
the question. I think I know the answer to it. Sorry for breaking off. Maybe a possible future feature of HTMX. Define an HTMX element that can be mapped to JSON. Say a button hits an API endpoint, receives JSON, I can convert it to HTML. Guess what, Gabe? First, there's something called, let me go over here, called extensions.
Yeah, it's under reference. Yeah, there you go.
And client-side templates.
Yeah.
So I can't remember which template languages are touched on in there, but
I think there's 3 of them.
Okay. Yeah. Like handlebars and nunchucks
Yep.
and stuff like that. Why don't I just click on it and find out for
Click
myself?
on it. There you go.
So, Gabe, I think that scratches some of the edge. It's not going to do the semantic part that you want about issuing the request or whatever, but you can just write an extension for it.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's some examples here of how you can work with JSON APIs if you need to.
All right. And then Craig has a point. We can skip over that. It's just about my example not being as good as it would be. I'll come back to some more of the demos so we can get back to the questions so we can get back to the demos. Okay, my friend, you get a chance to make your pitch. Same demo, but in the demo we just did, the tab bar had to be redrawn by the server. Wouldn't it be great? And what sucks is when you swap in the div, you might get the flash of the style or whatever, or the collapse and expand because the div is being removed. Wouldn't it be great if it was just this changing, but we still had some way to move the is selected?
Sure would. I will say htmx does make it possible to have nice animations on tab changes. So we do a lot of work to make sure you don't get that flash of unstyled content that you're talking about. But at the same time, a lot of people are very comfortable with front end scripting for this sort of stuff. And so hyperscript is a sibling project of htmx, which is front end scripting the way I would do it. And it's a different type of programming language. It's very event oriented. And it has this sort of natural language that we'll see here in a second.
So let me get people centered, and then you can handle line number 3. The idea is in this demo, we moved the tab list back into the original page.
Right.
And the only thing we really need to get now is the contents is the part that has to be changed. How do we handle it? With this little guy right here. And that's what you're going to talk about.
Yep. So yeah, exactly. So now rather than streaming back the tabs and the content below, we're just going to stream down the content below. And then on the client side, we're going to switch that is active class between the tabs. So the way that we're going to do that here is with hyperscript. And the way hyperscript works is you embed using the underscore attribute, which I'm sure will make some people a little bit antsy, but I like it. You embed a small script, and this is the syntax of hyperscript. And it says on htmx :afterload, so on that event, when that event hits this div, do something. And what that something is take the .isActive class. So that's a literal in the language. Hyperscript has support for CSS literals embedded directly in the language, so you don't have to use strings for them. Take .isActive for event target. And event target is, in this case, when after onload, it's going to be the tab. This is going to be triggered on the tab that was clicked. You can actually, believe it or not, you could change this to take.isActive for, and then the word the, and then say event '(s) target instead of dot. You can do '(s) there for the events target. This, I think, is kind of hyperscript is not for everybody. It's a language
I will note that because my example switched to Bulma and it's got a different set of tag hierarchy, this example doesn't work. I thought this was going to fix it and it didn't.
Okay.
And so it never moves the is active. So this is a bug in my current demo, which is why I didn't actually show the demo.
Sure, no problem. But in general, this is the idea on the front end is you're going to want to, if you want to write some scripting that enhances the stuff that's going on with your normal HTMX, you can use something like hyperscript if you're very brave, or Alpine.js is another good example of a front end JavaScript framework that plays really well with these events that are emitted.
Great article in Dev2 on Django HTMX, Tailwind CSS, and Alpine.js. There's a tutorial on that whole combination.
Yeah, great combo.
Here is a brief write-up about hyperscript with a link to the website, which looks like this.
Yeah.
Okay, let's take some questions and then get on to the fast API demos. Oh my God. I did not manage the time very well. It's 1 o'clock already. Okay,
Sorry.
so yes, with Python, Jinja to the back end, htmx would indeed be a great choice because you already know how to do HTML. You already know how to do modular snippets of HTML with macros and things like that. Let's see. There's a question about WASM, but we handled that earlier. Gabe is answering some questions. Thank you, Gabe. Trend is building for these combinations of Alpine.js and HTMX, etc. You're right. HTMX is made for the future. There's a question about building a community around this. I've got that in our wrap up, so we'll handle that. And then a question, generic question. No, just a comment that this is a completely different approach to a very basic problem, out of the box thinking, very interesting. So that is, I agree on all of that.
I appreciate that.
Let's switch over to some dynamic stuff that isn't just get. We'll do deleting a row. And then I'll have to speed through these a little bit. I'm in charge. I grant us 20 extra minutes.
Okay, I'm fine. I'm good until 11:30. So
okay, it's nice being those. Okay, deleting a row. So I'm sitting on here. I will open up the network, and I will click on deleting the first row. It will do a dialog confirmation that I didn't have to write any code to get. Wow, that's great. And when I say okay, you animate the disappearing of it and issue an HTTP delete. And friends, the fact that I have access to verbs not named get and post is a great and marvelous thing that should have been in HTML a long time ago.
Yeah, man.
Comments.
Man. Yeah, that's a great example. I do note there's looks like a little bit of a gremlin there with those two quotes, but we'll maybe figure that out. Yeah, this I think is a good example. You're clicking on the button, you're replacing the current row, presumably with no content, with that empty content. If we go and we look at the response, unfortunately, it has some characters in it, and those characters are going to be interpreted by HTMX as, oh, this is what's going to replace that table row. And so that's what's happening.
Yeah, we'll go take a look at the culprit here. This is in my fast API demo. This is delete a row. And the endpoint returns that.
Yeah, I would guess that's because it's a JSON response. Can that be an HTML response maybe?
Sure.
I don't know if there is an HTML response.
Hopefully I can still have the status code that I want.
Yeah, for sure. You should be able to.
Okay. Rerun this.
That's my guess. I'm not familiar with this server-side framework. Let's find out. There you go.
Well, Carson is a Python expert now. Excellent.
Python expert.
Put that on your LinkedIn resume.
Absolutely. But one thing, can you click on another row? And I want to talk about how that fade out works. So first of all, actually, can you cancel and just inspect that button? Because I want to look at the attributes and just show how that confirmation came up. Can you scroll to the right, and is it on here or is it up above? Did you factor it up? I just want to show HX confirm. Oh, there you go. It's right there. HX confirmed. So this has been hoisted up onto the table body. And so what that's going to say is that any action that occurs in here, we're going to confirm with this text before we perform it. And so when you have deletes, you typically want to say, hey, wait a second, are you sure you want to do this? And so, that's how that's achieved.
Which is nice. Putting the handler on every row is not a good thing.
Yeah. Exactly. And so that's an example where in order to avoid repeating yourself, you've hoisted the attributes up the DOM.
Yep.
So that's a great example. And then when you click on one of these buttons, it's going to take that new content, which is blank. And when it's swapping it in, it's going to transition the opacity of the old content to 0. You've got a nice CSS transition here. And that's how you get that nice fade out.
Here's the styling. And again, you are in charge of adding and removing these CSS classes.
Right.
We just have a declarative interface to make all that stuff happen. And then
exactly.
I have access to CSS styling. I don't have to do CSS in JavaScript or something. So I click it, I confirm, and I get that nice animation.
Exactly. And HTMX will do the right thing as far as waiting for it to finish and then swap the stuff in and so forth. So really, again, we're trying to surface these technologies that are available in the browser in HTML. Stuff that typically you had to crack open JavaScript in order to get at them are now available to you just using plain HTML.
Yep. One question came in again about WebAssembly. In my book, totally independent of WebAssembly, which can't yet talk to the DOM.
Yeah. Yep.
And so HTMX is very, very, very much about the DOM.
Yep. HTMX is really, again, a return to that model, to the original model of the web, hypermedia. Let's use hypermedia for stuff.
Let's use hypermedia. I'll skip the animations demo and do inline validation because this really paints the scene for progressive enhancement in places where just HTML out of the box isn't a good enough user experience. So I did not, I ran out of time. I didn't restyle this for Bulma, so it's a little bit ugly. But it's a form. We'll look at the code in a second. And I put in x@y.org. And when I lose focus, the server tells me, can't do that. And I'm like, well, wrong. I can do that, actually. So let's take a look at this. I'll go back to PyCharm and give us a little more room on this.
Yep.
This is inline validation and the demo. This is everything that we got to look at. I mean, this isn't like, 50 dependencies and all this other stuff. But I'll admit, this one was a little squirrely for me. So kind of the inner outer part got me a little bit. So I'll let you give the explanation of what we're doing.
Yeah. So this is an input. And so the default action on an input in contrast with a button. So on a button, the default action, or the default trigger, I should say, is going to be click. With input, it's going to be changed. And so when someone changes this input, we're going to issue a request. We're going to issue a request to inline validation / check email. And there's an indicator that'll show as that check is being done. And what you're going to do when you get that content back is you're going to swap in this entire enclosing div. So the HX target in this case has been hoisted up onto the div. We're using the this keyword, which says this is the target. And then we're going to replace the entire HTML of it. So we're not going to swap in content on the inside. We're going to swap the entire thing out for whatever comes back. And so again, typically on the server side, what you do is you would factor this part of your template out into a separate file, right? Because this is the granularity that we're looking at here. We want to factor this out, and then you would just render that as a partial here. And then also in your inline validation / check email, there you would render that same smaller template to return the content. And this content would then, you do your normal check to see if it's unique on the server side and potentially slam an error class on it or whatever you want to do. But that would be the same, hopefully, in both the Ajax situation as well as the non-Ajax situation. And so because of that, you'd have the same logic in both places, and all you would have to do is just re-render this small little bit. So that's the idea here.
Yeah, and back to the question why we hate JavaScript. What if they turn JavaScript off in the browser? This will still work.
Yeah, you do. You're
just having a blank spot where the JSX would have rendered.
Right. You always have to do your checks again on the server side, right? You can't trust validations that are done purely on the client side. HTMX does also integrate with the client side, with the HTML validation specification. So there's a spec for doing validations on the client side, and so HTMX will respect those validations, run them before it tries to issue a request.
Sure.
So you can integrate with that if you,
so
you can integrate with that if you want. But for something like this, where you need to check whether or not an email is unique, you're going to have to make a server request. And so the HTMX way is to do that by exchanging hypermedia with the server rather than a little bit of JSON.
I just realized I buried the whole lead on this entire thing, which is HTMX means you don't reload the page.
Right.
So you do things like preserve scroll position, you preserve form input, etc. So for example, I'm going to scroll down so that input validation goes off the screen. And when I go and do this, my scroll position doesn't change.
That's right.
The rest of the page doesn't blink.
Yep.
Everything in the DOM stays where it was. Yep. There are some things that I wasn't showing. Actually, I'll show it with this. As I go, I HTMXified the demos. So as I move through these, I'm using hx-history or push URL to interact with the history to update the URL of the browser. So there are some history API ways to invoke all of this as well. Let me get to
very simple. You don't need to get into the muck of that API.
That's right.
Which is a terrible API.
Big muck, especially cross-browser. So one point, I'll read this in its entirety since it's a nice pat on the back for you.
Okay.
I think Carson is making history here. We might see a different direction for web development, especially for light sites like on feature phones that cost $50 in emerging countries that are low on resources.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it. I don't think I'm necessarily, I don't know. I like HTMX quite a bit. I think it's a good model. I think it's taking the web seriously, taking the web architecture seriously. And hypermedia is just a great idea. So I don't, I think I appreciate that comment, but I think at some level I'd be dumb enough to want to do it the simple way too. Just smart enough to make it work.
There's a comment about the combination of HTMX and Chameleon templates, both being attribute based. Thank you for saying that. I was actually the one back in '99 that kind of came up with the predecessor of Chameleon, Zope page templates. On to, let's see, I'm going to stop on the fast API demo, not show the I'll just show the active search real quick. So we have a little bit of a delay to do debouncing and all of that. And it's just really, really simple stuff. I've got a post and I've got a trigger, a delay, a target, all of these directive attribute things that we've seen before.
Yep.
So if it's okay with you, I'm going to switch over to the Django HTMX package.
Okay.
Do a quick demo and then we'll wrap up. I will keep this under like 3 or 4 minutes. This is the demo package that ships with HTMX. What is HTMX? Django HTMX. It's a Python package you can install from PyPI with pip that does some of the pre-wiring of HTMX for you, including it in templates and stuff like that. So in your Django app, you say, I've got this as installed app. I have middleware, several different middlewares that I can add to this. And then I can go write my templates in a way that include these things. Let me show you how I can Alt-Enter in all of our IDEs and add that so it doesn't give a warning. And this was a little bit of what Carson was talking about before, plumbing it deeper into your app server for things like CSRF tokens. So I'm going to play this demo. Click on the link. And Adam, the creator of this, has 4 demos. One of them is CSRF. Oh, no. Yes, that is odd. But this is not odd. And it's doing CSRF along the way. I'll do partial rendering at the end. Middleware tester just wants to see, did I click on something? Yes, I did. Watch the timestamp here. That's pretty fast.
Yeah.
For round trip.
Again, it's you're seeing here how we're not reloading the whole page when you click that, right? It's really nice to be able to do that.
But we're also sending back small snippets that have less latency, less server time being generated on the server, less parse time, all those kinds of things, rather than sending a full page.
Yep.
Which leads me to partial rendering, and this is an idea that's really well explored in the Django HTMX package. This idea that you're breaking your base layout into partials of pages. For example, partial rendering. What he does in this demo is the part that we want to send back on these HTMX interactions isn't the whole page. But we also don't want to have to kind of like inline or repeat over and over and over. We want a snippet to be usable when we ask for the whole thing. We want a snippet to be usable when we only ask for part of the thing.
Right.
And this demo shows examples of that.
Yeah, it's very common in your
comment on that.
It's very common in your controller to check. So HTMX, when it makes a request, includes the hx-request header equals true. And so it's a very common pattern on backends is to say, is that header present? If yes, render just the small bit of the UI. If not, render the whole UI. So render with the layout and all that sort of stuff. And that mixes well when you create deep links. You know, one problem you have with a lot of JavaScript-based web apps is you can't support deep links. Well, HTMX supports this hx push URL to push the URL up into the browser, but then the browser needs to be able to handle both the HTMX request as well as the normal request. And so depending on your backend framework, there are various ways to achieve that. Sometimes a middleware does it, you know, it just depends.
The thing you're describing is where a lot of JavaScript-based routers go to die.
Yep.
they can't quite handle the hash-based syntax or the push state syntax and all these other things.
Yeah, if only there were some sort of resource locator that was universal.
and a protocol that was aware of it.
Yes. Yeah. Maybe use a hypermedia of some sort.
Okay. We will go ahead and start the wrap up portion of this so that you can get out remotely on time. Before we wrap up, I'm going to come back to something that was asked near the beginning. What's next for HTMX and hyperscript? And would you like people to get involved?
Yeah. So HTMX, I feel like is pretty close to being done. So there's not a lot to contribute there except for examples and then work on server side stuff. So HTMX being purely front end, I think examples with particular frameworks on the back end so people have stuff to get going with would be very helpful. And then also like HTMX Django, creating packages that sort of make HTMX dovetail well with whatever backend you prefer would be very helpful. My primary source of compensation is GitHub stars, so I'm always appreciative if people head over and star the repo on GitHub. And we do have a pretty active Discord, which is friendly. I try and keep it pretty friendly, and so you're welcome to jump on there if you want to chat about this stuff. Hyperscript is a little bit more speculative and a little bit crazier, but I think that's also almost is getting pretty close to complete as well. But if you're into programming languages, you can jump on the Discord, and there's a hyperscript channel as well.
And I guess extensions, people can write extensions, right?
Yeah, you could write extensions. If you have
a way to contribute to go scratch some itches that other people might like. There's a ticket. I don't know if this will be extension. I think it's currently extension. Helmet is a popular meme in the JavaScript world about components that need to update the head, and dealing with the head is a tricky wasteland. And so there might be some places, tickets and things like that would be pretty interesting for people to contribute on.
Sure.
All right. Thanks, Carson, for joining us on this joyride through HTMX and the world of Python. And really, a big thanks for htmx itself and advocating all these back to basics, back to the future, believe in the web story that's really starting to emerge in the last year. I know it must be exhausting, so major kudos and thanks.
Yeah, well, it goes to show you never know, because if you'd asked me, I put Intercooler out in 2013, and if you'd asked me, 5 years ago, if this was ever going to make a comeback, I would have said no. But I also would have said, everyone would be writing everything in JavaScript. And so funny how things work out. And I appreciate you, and I appreciate all the podcasters who have had me on to talk about it, particularly when HTMX isn't specific to your, domain.
Sure.
But hopefully it lets people work in the domains that they like. And if it, helps people stay within the hypermedia model, then that's great.
All right. We'll finish up with a word from our sponsor. If you'd like to get more information on PyCharm, please go to our website at jetbrains.com/PyCharm. Look, it's another one of those universal resource locators. If you haven't already, please check out.
They're everywhere.
Yeah, we can't have enough of them. Check out our PyCharm blog, where you can find up-to-date news about PyCharm releases. Something might be happening pretty soon, and other events such as this webinar. In addition to our educational resources, we would love your feedback on this webinar. We actually pay attention to the survey, so if you register, please fill it in. I'll pass the news on to Carson as well about any comments you have or any topics that you would like to see covered in the future. Come and chat with us on Twitter about this topic or about webinars or PyCharm or the web or anything that you've got on your mind. That is all from us today. Thank you to our esteemed guests, and even more to our esteemed viewers. I like to finish with a little bit of pandering. Thank you for joining us today, and hope you have a great rest of the week.
Thank you, Paul.